Strange Candy by Laurell K. Hamilton. This one is for all those editors who took a chance on me when I was an unknown, to everyone who bought my stories when putting my name on the front of their magazine or in their anthology didn't guarantee them more sales. Thanks for taking a chance on me. Introduction. Welcome to the parts of my imagination that do not get much play at book length. Some people see short stories as a way to further their book career. The last story, The Girl Who Was Infatuated with Death, was commissioned by my publisher for a collection of pieces with other of their supernatural writers. So I guess that one was designed to further my reading audience, and these of the other writers with me in the anthology. But as for the rest of the stories, these are ideas I was compelled to write by nothing but my sometime peculiar imagination and a desire to play. Short stories for me are like vacations. You know, those trips you take to new places to do things you don't normally get to do in your workaday life. These stories, with a few exceptions, are worlds where most of you have never been with me. Several of these are set in the same world as my first book, Nightseer. So for those of you who keep writing in or asking at signings, when will I finish that series, here are at least a few more pieces of that world, though with different characters and countries. I thought once I would write only heroic fantasy, like a mix of Tolkien and Robert E. Howard, but the bottom fell out of the heroic fantasy market, and I was left scrambling to find a vision that the publishers would buy. I had a few stories that were different, set in modern day with fantastic elements. One was the first Anita Blake short story, Those Who Seek Forgiveness. Another was Edge of the Sea, which is still an idea that intrigues me. You have also my only completed science fiction story, Here Be Monsters. You also get the only story I've ever written in Anita's world that has none of the main characters in it, Selling Houses. I have dozens of other short story ideas, and most of them are very unlike Anita and Mary's adventures. My unwritten short ideas are vacations of the mind. The last thing you want to do on vacation is your normal job. So how does a girl get to a point where normal is vampire hunting, fairy princesses, and private detectives, and some of the most erotic relationships on paper? Just lucky, I guess. Those Who Seek Forgiveness. This is the first time Anita ever walked onto paper for me. The cemetery in this story is based on the cemetery where my mother is buried. It was a place I knew very well, because my grandmother, who raised me, took me often. I guess it was inevitable that I would write about the dead. My childhood was haunted by death. Not real ghosts, but the ghosts of memory and loss. Anita raises the dead in this story, which was all I had planned on her doing. The idea of her being a legal vampire executioner actually didn't hit my radar until quite late in trying to write the first book. Originally, this story represented what I thought Anita would do, raise zombies. How different things would have been if I'd stuck to my original plan. No Jean-Claude, no Richard, not much of anybody except Anita. What a bleak world it would have been, with just Anita and me in it.
Death is a very serious matter, Mrs. Fisk. People who go through it are never the same. The woman leaned forward, cradling her face in her hands. Her slim shoulders shook quietly for a few minutes. I passed another box of tissues her way. She groped for them blindly, then looked up. I know you can't bring him back, exactly. She wiped at 2 tears, which escaped and rolled down flawless cheekbones. The purse she clutched so tightly was reptile, at least $200. Her accessories, lapel pin, high heels, hat, and gloves, were all black as her purse. Her suit was gray. Neither color suited her, but they emphasized her pale skin and hollow eyes. She was the sort of woman that made me feel too short, too dark, and gave me the strange desire to lose 10 more pounds. If she hadn't been so genuinely grief-stricken, I could have disliked her. I have to talk to Arthur. That's my husband. Was my husband. She took a deep breath and tried again. Arthur died suddenly. A massive coronary. She blew delicately into a tissue. His family did have a history of heart disease, but he always took such good care of himself. She finished with a watery hiccup. "I want to say goodbye to him, Miss Blake." I smiled reassuringly. We all have things left unsaid when death comes suddenly, but it isn't always best to raise the dead and say it. Her blue eyes stared intently through a film of tears. I was going to discourage her, as I discourage every one of my clients, but this one would do it. There was a certain set to the eyes that said, serious. "There are certain limitations to the process," I said. My boss didn't allow us to show slides or pictures or give graphic descriptions, but we were supposed to tell the truth. One good picture of a decaying zombie would have sent most of my clients screaming. "Limitations?" "Yes. We can bring him back. You came to us promptly. That helps. He's been buried only 3 days. But as a zombie, your husband will only have limited use of his body and mind. And as the days go by, that will grow worse, not better." She stood up very straight, tears drying on her face. "I was hoping you could bring him back as a vampire." I kept my face carefully blank. "Vampires are illegal, Mrs. Fisk." "A friend told me that you could get that done here." She finished in a rush, searching my face. I smiled my best professional smile. "We do not do vampires. And even if we did, you can't make an ordinary corpse into a vampire." "Ordinary?" Very few people who came to us had even a remote idea of how rare vampires were, or why. The deceased would have to have been bitten by a werewolf, vampire, or other supernatural creature while alive. Being buried in unconsecrated ground would help. Your husband, Arthur, was never bitten by a vampire while alive, was he? "No," she half laughed. "He was bitten by my Yorkshire Terrier once." I smiled, encouraging her turn of spirits. "That won't quite do it. Your husband can come back as a zombie, or not at all." "I'll take it," she said quietly, all serious and very still. "I will warn you that most families find it advisable to lay the zombie to rest after a time." "Why?" "Why? I saw the happy family embracing their lost loved one. I saw the family sick, horrified, bringing the decaying corpse to be put down. The smiling relative reduced to a shambling horror. What exactly do you want Arthur to do when he arises?" She looked down and shredded another tissue. "I want to say goodbye to him." "Yes, Mrs. Fisk, but what do you want him to do?" She was silent for several minutes. I decided to prompt her. "For instance, a woman came in wanting her husband raised so he could take out life insurance. I told her most insurance companies won't insure the walking dead." She grinned at that. "And that is what Arthur will come back as, the walking dead." Her smile faltered, and tears came again. "I want Arthur to forgive me." She hid her face in her hands and sobbed. "I had an affair for several months. He found out, and had a heart attack and died." She seemed to gain strength from the words, and the tears slowed. "You see that I have to talk to him one last time. I have to tell him I love him, only him. I want Arthur to forgive me. Can he do that as a zombie?" "I found that the dead are very forgiving of the living when they die of natural causes. Your husband will have ample brain power to speak. He will be himself at first. As the days progress, he will lose memory. He will begin to decay, first mentally, then physically." "Decay?" "Yes, slowly, but after all, he is dead." The relatives didn't really believe that a fresh zombie wasn't alive. Knowing intellectually that someone smiling and talking as the walking dead is one thing. Emotionally, it's very different. But they believed it as time passed, and as he or she began to look like a walking corpse. "It's temporary, then?" "Not exactly." I came from behind the desk and sat next to her. "He could stay a zombie possibly forever, but his physical and mental state would deteriorate until he was not much better than an automaton in tattered flesh." "Tattered flesh?" she whispered. I touched her hand. "I know it's a hard choice. But that is the reality. Tattered flesh didn't really touch the white sheen of bone through rotting flesh, but it was a term our boss allowed. She gripped my hand and smiled. Thank you for telling me the truth. I still want to bring Arthur back, even if it's just long enough to say a few words. So she was going to do it, as I had known she would. So you don't want him for weeks or days, only long enough to talk. I think so. I don't mean to rush you, Mrs. Fisk, but I need to know before we set up an appointment. You see, it takes more time and energy to raise and then lay to rest, one right after another. If she laid and raised quickly enough, Mrs. Fisk might be able to remember Arthur at his best. Oh, of course. If possible, I would like to talk for several hours. Then it's best if you take him home for at least the evening. We can schedule putting him back for tomorrow night. I would push for a quick laying to rest. I didn't think Mrs. Fisk could take watching her husband rot before her eyes. That sounds good. She took a deep breath. I knew what she was going to say. She looked so brave and resolute. I want to be there when you bring him back. Your presence is required, Mrs. Fisk. You see, a zombie has no real will of its own. Your husband should be able to think on his own at first, but as time wears on, the zombie finds it very difficult to decide things. The person or persons who raised it will have control over it. You and I? Yes. She paled even more, her grip tightening. Mrs. Fisk? I got her a glass of water. Sip it slowly. When she seemed better, I asked, Are you sure you're up to this tonight? Is there anything I need to bring? A suit of your husband's clothes would be nice. Maybe a favorite object, hat, trophy, to help him orient himself. The rest I'll supply. I hesitated, because some of the color had crept into her face, but she needed to be prepared. There will be blood at the ceremony. Blood? Her voice was a breathy whisper. Chicken. I'll bring it. There will also be some ointment to spread over our faces and hands. It glows faintly and smells fairly strange, but not unpleasant. Her next question would be the usual. What do we do with the blood? I gave the usual answer. We sprinkle some on the grave and some on us. She swallowed very carefully, looking slightly gray. You can back out now, but not later. Once you've paid your deposit, it can't be refunded. And once the ceremony begins, to break the circle is very dangerous. She looked down, thinking. I liked that. Most who agreed right away were afraid later. The brave ones took time to answer. Yes. She sounded very convinced. To make peace with Arthur, I can do it. Good for you. How is tonight? About midnight, she added hopefully. I smiled. Everyone thought midnight was the perfect time for raising the dead. All that was required was darkness. Some people did put a great deal of stock in certain phases of the moon, but I had never found it necessary. No, how about 9 o'clock? 9? If that will be all right. I have 2 other appointments tonight, and 9 was left open. She smiled. That will be fine. Her hand shook as she signed the check for half the fee, the other half to be delivered after the raising. We shook hands, and she said, Call me Carla. I'm Anita. I'll see you at 9 tonight at Wellington Cemetery. I continued for her, between 2 large trees and across from the only hill. Yes, thank you. She flashed a watery smile and was gone. I buzzed our receptionist area. Mary, I'm booked up for this week and won't be seeing any more clients until at least next Tuesday. I'll see to it, Anita. I leaned back in my chair and soaked up the silence. 3 animations a night was my limit. Tonight they were all routine, or almost. I was bringing back my first research scientist. His 3 colleagues couldn't figure out his notes, and their deadline, or rather grant, was running close. So dear Dr. Richard Norris was coming back from the dead to help them out. They were scheduled for midnight. At 3 this next morning, I would meet the widowed Mrs. Steiner. She wanted her husband to clear up some nasty details with his will. Being an animator meant very little nightlife. No pun intended. Afternoons were spent interviewing clients and evenings raising the dead. Though we few were very popular at a certain kind of party. The sort where the host likes to brag about how many celebrities he knows, or worse yet, the kind who simply want to stare. I don't like being on display, and refuse to go to parties unless forced. Our boss likes to keep us in the public eye to dispel rumors that we are witches or hobgoblins. It's pretty pitiful at parties. All the animators huddled, talking shop like a bunch of doctors. But doctors don't get called witch, monster, zombie queen. Very few people remember to call us animators. For most, we are a dark joke. This is Anita. She makes zombies, and I don't mean the drink. Then there would be laughter all around, and I would smile politely and know I'd be going home early. Tonight there was no party to worry over, just work. Work was power, magic, a strange dark impulse to raise more than what you were paid for. Tonight would be cloudless, moonlit, and starred. I could feel it. We were different, drawn to the night, unafraid of death in its many forms, because we had a sympathy for it. Tonight I would raise the dead. Wellington Cemetery was new. All the tombstones were nearly the same size, square or rectangle, and set off into the night in near-perfect rows. Young trees and perfectly clipped evergreen shrubs lined the gravel driveway. The moon rode strong and high, bathing the scene clearly, if mysteriously, in silver and black. A handful of huge trees dotted the grounds. They looked out of place among all this newness. As Carla had said, only 2 of them grew close together. The drive spilled into the open and encircled the hill. The mound of grass-covered earth was obviously man-made, so round, short, and domed. 3 other drives centered on it. A short way down the west drive stood 2 large trees. As my car crunched over gravel, I could see someone dressed in white. A flare of orange was a match, and the reddish pinpoint of a cigarette sprang to life. I stopped the car, blocking the drive. But few people on honest business visit cemeteries at night. Carla had beaten me here, very unusual. Most clients want to spend as little time as possible near the grave, after dark. I walked over to her before unloading the equipment. There was a litter of burned-out cigarettes like stubby white bugs about her feet. She must have been here in the dark for hours, waiting to raise a zombie. She was either punishing herself or enjoyed the idea. There was no way of knowing which. Her dress, shoes, even hose were white. Earrings of silver flashed in the moonlight as she turned to me. She was leaning against one of the trees, and its black trunk emphasized her whiteness. She only turned her head as I came up to her. Her eyes looked silver-gray in the light. I couldn't decipher the look on her face. It wasn't grief. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it?" I agreed that it was. "Carla, are you all right?" She stared at me terribly calm. "I'm feeling much better than I did this afternoon." "I'm very glad to hear that. Did you remember to bring his clothes and a memento?" She motioned to a dark bundle by the tree. "Good. I'll unload the car." She didn't offer to help, which was not unusual. Most of the time it was fear that prevented it. I realized my Omega was the only car in sight. I called softly, but sound carries on summer nights. "How did you get here? I don't see a car." "I hired a cab. It's waiting at the gate." A cab? I would love to have seen the driver's face when he dropped her off at the cemetery gates. The 3 black chickens clucked from their cage in the back seat. They didn't have to be black, but it was the only color I could get for tonight. I was beginning to think our poultry supplier had a sense of humor. Arthur Fisk was only recently dead, so from the box in the trunk I took only a jar of homemade ointment and a machete. The ointment was pale off-white with flecks of greenish light in it. The glowing flecks were graveyard mold. You wouldn't find it in this cemetery. It only grew in graveyards that had stood for at least 100 years. The ointment also contained the obligatory spider webs and other noisome things, plus herbs and spices to hide the smell and aid the magic, if it was magic. I smeared the tombstone with it and called Carla over. "It's your turn now, Carla." She stubbed out her cigarette and came to stand before me. I smeared her face and hands and told her, "You stand just behind the tombstone throughout the raising." She took her place without a word while I placed ointment on myself. The pine scent of rosemary for memory, cinnamon and cloves for preservation, sage for wisdom, and lemon thyme to bind it all together seemed to soak through the skin itself. I picked the largest chicken and tucked it under my arm. Carla stood where I had left her, staring down at the grave. There was an art to beheading a chicken with only 2 hands. I stood at the foot of the grave to kill the chicken. Its first artery blood splashed onto the grave. It splattered over the fading chrysanthemums, roses, and carnations. A spire of white gladioli turned dark. I walked a circle, sprinkling blood as I went, tracing a circle of steel with a bloody machete. Carla shut her eyes as the blood rained upon her. I smeared blood on myself and placed the still twitching body upon the flower mound. Then I stood once again at the foot of the grave. We were cut off now inside the blood circle, alone with the night and our thoughts. Carla's eyes flashed white at me as I began the chant. "Hear me, Arthur Fisk. I call you from the grave. By blood, magic, and steel, I call you. Arise, Arthur. Come to us. Come to me, Arthur Fisk." Carla joined me as she was supposed to. "Come to us, Arthur. Come to us, Arthur." "Arthur, arise." We called his name in ever-rising voices. The flowers shuddered. The mound heaved upward, and the chicken slid to the side. A hand clawed free, ghostly pale. A second hand, and Carla's voice failed her. She began moving round the gravestone to kneel to the left of the heaving mound. There was such wonder, even awe, in her face as I called Arthur Fisk from the grave. The arms were free. The top of a dark-haired head was in sight, but the top was almost all there was. The mortician had done his best, but Arthur's had been a closed casket funeral. The right side of his face was gone, blasted away. Clean white bone shone at jaw and skull, and silver bits of wire where the bone had been strung together. It still wasn't a face. The nose was empty holes, bare and white. The skin was shredded and snipped short to look neater. The left eye rolled wildly in the bare socket. I could see the tongue moving between the broken teeth. Arthur Fisk struggled from the grave. I tried to remain calm. It could be a mistake. "Is that Arthur?" Her hoarse whisper came to me. "Yes." "That is not a heart attack." "No." Her voice was calm now, incredibly normal. "No, I shot him at close range." "You killed him and had me bring him back?" Arthur was having some trouble freeing his legs, and I ran to Carla. I tried to help her to her feet, but she wouldn't move. "Get up! Get up, damn it! He'll kill you!" Her next words were very quiet. "If that's what he wants." "God help me! A suicide!" I forced her to look at me instead of the thing in the grave. "Carla, a murdered zombie always kills his murderer first. Always. No forgiveness. That is a rule. I can't control him until after he's killed you. You have to run. Now!" She saw me, understood, I think, but said, "This is the only way to be free of guilt. If he forgives me, I'll be free." "You'll be dead." Arthur freed himself and was sitting on the crushed, earth-strewn flowers. It would take him a little while to organize, but not too long. "Carla, he will kill you. There will be no forgiveness." Her eyes had wandered back to the zombie, and I slapped her twice very hard. "Carla, you will die out here, and for what? Arthur is dead, really dead. You don't want to die." Arthur slid off the flowers and stood uncertainly. His eye, rolling around in its socket, finally spotted us. Though he didn't have much to show expression with, I could see joy on his shattered face. There was a twitch of a smile as he shambled toward us. I began dragging her away. She didn't fight me, but she was a dead, awkward weight. It is very hard to drag someone away if they don't want to go. I let her sink back to the ground. I looked at the clumsy but determined zombie and decided to try. I stood in front of him, blocking him from Carla. I called upon whatever power I possessed and talked to him. "Arthur Fisk, hear me! Listen only to me!" He stopped moving and stared down at me. It was working. Against all the rules, it was working. It was Carla who spoiled it, her voice saying, "Arthur, Arthur, forgive me." He was distracted and tried to move toward her voice. I stopped him with a hand on his chest. "Arthur, I command you, do not move. I who raised you command you." She called one more time. That was all he needed. He flung me away absent-mindedly. My head hit the tombstone. It wasn't much of a blow, no blood like on television, but it took everything out of me for a minute. I lay in the flowers, and it seemed very important to hear myself breathe. Arthur reached down for her, slowly. His face twitched, and his tongue made small sounds that might have been Carla. The clumsy hand stroked her hair. He half fell, half knelt by her. She drew back at that, afraid. I started crawling over the flowers toward them. She was not going to commit suicide with my help. The hands stroked her face, and she backed away just a few inches. The thing crawled after her. She backpedaled faster, but he came on surprisingly quick. He pinned her under his body, and she started screaming. I half crawled, half fell across the zombie's back. The hands crept up her body, touching shoulders. Her eyes rolled back to me. "Help me!" I tried. I tugged at him, trying to pull him off her. Zombies do not have supernatural strength, no matter what the media would like you to think. But Arthur had been a large, muscular man. If he could have felt pain, I might have pulled him off, but there was no real way to distract him. "Anita, please!" The hands settled on her neck and squeezed. I found the machete where it had dropped to the ground. It was sharp, and did damage, but he couldn't feel it. I chopped at his head and back. He ignored me. Even decapitated, he would keep coming. His hands were the problem. I knelt and sighted at his lower arm. I didn't dare try it any closer to her face. The blade flashed silver. I brought it down with all the strength in my back and arms, but it took 5 blows to break the bone. The separated hand kept squeezing as if it were still attached. I threw the machete down and began prying 1 finger at a time from her neck. It was time-consuming. Carla stopped struggling. I screamed my rage and helplessness at him and kept prying up the fingers. The strong hand squeezed until there was a cracking sound. Not a sharp pencil break like a leg or arm, but a crackling as the bones crushed together. Arthur seemed satisfied. He stood up from the body. All expression left him. He was empty, waiting for a command. I fell back into the flowers, not sure whether to cry or scream or just run. I just sat there and shook. But I had to do something about the zombie. I couldn't just leave him to wander around. I tried to tell him to stay, but my voice wouldn't come. His eye followed me as I stumbled to the car. I came back with a handful of salt. In the other hand, I scooped the fresh grave dirt. Arthur watched me without expression. I stood at the outer edge of the circle. "I give you back to the earth from which you came." I threw the dirt upon him. He turned to face me. "With salt, I bind you to your grave." The salt sounded like sleet on his suit. I made the sign of a cross with the machete. "With steel, I give you back." I realized that I had begun the ceremony without getting another chicken. I bent and retrieved the dead one and slit it open. I drew still warm and bloody entrails free. They glistened in the moonlight. "With flesh and blood, I command you, Arthur, return to your grave and walk no more." He lay down upon the grave. It was as if he had lain in quicksand. It just swallowed him up. With the last shifting of flowers, the grave was as before, almost. I threw the gutted chicken to the ground and knelt beside the woman's body. Her neck flopped at an angle just slightly wrong. I got up and shut the trunk of my car. The sound seemed to echo, too loud. Wind seemed to roar in the tall trees. The leaves rustled and whispered. The trees all looked like flat, black shadows. Nothing had any depth to it. All noises were too loud. The world had become a one-dimensional cardboard thing. I was in shock. It would keep me numb and safe for a little while. Would I dream about Carla tonight? Would I try to save her again and again? I hoped not. Somewhere up above, nighthawks flitted. Their cries came thin and eerie, echoing loud. I looked at the body by the grave, the whiteness of it stained now with dirt. So much for the other half of my fee. I got in the car, smearing blood over the steering wheel and key. There were phone calls to make, to my boss, the police, and to cancel the rest of my appointments. I would be raising no more dead tonight. There was a taxi to send away. I wondered how much the meter had run up. My thoughts ran in dull, frightened circles. I began to shake, hands trembling. Tears came hot and violent. I sobbed and screamed in the privacy of my car. When I could breathe without choking, and my hand was steady, I put the car in gear. I would definitely be seeing Carla tonight, and Arthur. What's one more nightmare? I left Carla there alone, with Arthur's forgiveness, one leg lost in the flowers of his grave.
A Lust of Cupids. I feel like we need a depth chamber between this and the preceding story. We're moving from almost as dark as I get as a writer to almost as light as I get. I got a lot of nice rejection slips on this story. Editors loved it, but not enough to buy it. One editor at one of the top-paying magazines at the time actually told me the truth, that since they published only one piece of fiction in each issue, I wasn't a big enough name to help their magazine sales. But she adored the story. When I became a big enough name to make a difference, I did not send the story back to her for another chance. 1, I was too busy with novels to think about it. 2, I'm petty. It's the same story. The only thing that changed was that now I was a name. I rarely give second chances.
A Lust of Cupids. I was walking along Market Street on my lunch hour, wishing I hadn't worn high heels today, or a skirt. Pantyhose were no protection at all against the icy winter air. I was minding my own business when I saw them. They floated by the streetlight at the corner like gigantic moths attracted to the cold electric light. Half a dozen small naked children with cotton candy wings and curly ringlets, mostly blonde. They were also carefully neuter, smooth as a Barbie doll. Cupids. Shit. That was all I needed. I looked for a door, a shop, anything that I could take refuge in. The brick buildings stretched smooth and doorless. There was a small shop across the street, but I'd never make it. Too open. No cover. I began to walk sideways, back down the street, one hand on the wall to make sure I didn't trip. If I could just make the far corner, maybe I could run for it. But it was too late. They had spotted me. One of the chubby pink things strung his tiny golden bow and began to sift through his quiver for an arrow. His shiny little eyes never left me. I wasn't close enough to see his eyes, but I knew what color they were. All Cupids have sky blue eyes, like Easter eggs or baby blankets. I didn't wait to see what color of arrow it chose. I turned and ran. My high heels seemed to echo the narrow street. They'd find me. Damn it. I made it around the corner and found every building as blank and smooth as the Cupids themselves. I had just walked down the street. There should have been doors, shops, people. I had heard that Cupids could cloud your mind, but I had never believed, until now. I darted a look behind me. Nothing. I wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a bad one. They either had given up, or were so sure of me that they didn't need to hurry, or they were right above me and I just couldn't see them, like the doors that should have been here. I wanted to scream and rant and stomp my feet, but that wouldn't help. Think, Rachel, think. If I couldn't see the doors, maybe I could feel them. Cupids wouldn't follow me inside. I had walked the street 100 times. Surely I could remember where one door was. Any door. My hands slid over cold, blank bricks. If there was something there, I couldn't feel it. The Cupids flew around the corner. There were 6 of them, hovering, soft pastel wings fluttering like lazy butterflies. The look in their eyes wasn't soft, it was cold. I flattened myself against the wall and screamed, "Leave me alone, you overweight cherubs!" They glanced at each other. Maybe I had offended them. I hoped so. A cupid with soft pink wings drew an arrow from behind his back. The rest of them hovered like chubby vultures. A man yelled, "In here!" I glanced to my right and found a door open and a man motioning to me. "Run for it," he said. I ran for it. I was almost to the door when my heel broke and sent me sprawling on the sidewalk. Something whirred over my head and thunked into the door. The white arrow vibrated in the door. White, the color of true love. Shit! A hand grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. I scrambled inside the shop on hands and knees, no time to be ladylike. A tall, broad-shouldered man closed the door and asked, "Are you all right?" I nodded, still sitting on the floor, staring at the arrow. It was already beginning to evaporate. In a few minutes it would be gone, no danger of us mere mortals getting a hold of one of those arrows of love. Once fired, they just didn't last. "What did I do to deserve white?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. "Are you over 30? The man asked. I thought that was a rather rude question from a stranger, but he had saved me. "Why do you ask?" "Because once you're over 30, the little things get pesky. I'm 35 and never been married. Something in a cupid just can't stand that." I smiled. 33, never married, never want to be. He offered me a hand up. I took it. His hand was big like him and nearly swallowed my hand to the wrist. His eyes were perfect brown, like polished chestnut. Curly brown hair was cut short and had never seen the inside of a styling salon. I couldn't stand straight with only one heel, so I took the shoes off. It was lucky I wore heels today. "Damn straight. How many of them are after you?" "6. He gave a low whistle. "They want you bad." I nodded. He was right. One cupid was standard, maybe even 2. They didn't seem to like to be alone much, but a lust of cupids was a damn posse, all for little ol' me. Had I offended someone? I had an awful thought, an uncharitable thought. Had my mother paid them off? Slipped one of the little winged horrors some sweets? Cupids didn't need money, but they loved candies and desserts. It was frowned upon, but everyone knew it happened. Corrupt cupids with a sweet tooth. "I'm Tom Hagen," the man said. "Rachel Cardigan." We shook hands again, and his hand was warm and calloused. There was something oddly appealing about his square face. If I hadn't known better, I'd have wondered if a pink arrow had gotten me. Pink for infatuation. "Were you out to lunch?" he asked. "Yes," he smiled. "Well, it isn't much, but I'll split mine with you. Cupids don't have much patience. They'll wander off if you can hide long enough." "You sound like an expert." "Hey, I'm 2 years older than you. They've been after me longer." I laughed. "All right, if you're sure it's not trouble." "It isn't like the shop is busy today." I glanced around the warm interior of the shop for the first time. Hand-carved wood was everywhere. Small furniture, shelves, animals, all the folksy wooden things that the tourists bought in droves. But it was winter now, and the tourists were gone. I always wondered how some of the shops made it through the off-season. One of the good things about being a lawyer, crime was always in season. Tom brought a rocking chair he'd made himself to sit beside his own chair. He gave me a lap-sized linen napkin to spread over my business skirt, and shared a huge roast beef sandwich and apple pie. The pie was delicious, and I said so. "Made it myself." He seemed embarrassed but pleased. Since I couldn't boil soup without burning it, I was impressed. I called my office and said I'd be later without explaining the reason. We spent a very pleasant time drinking fresh coffee and talking about small things. Nothing major or earth-shattering, but comfortable. Tom glanced at the clock. "I hate to say it, but it's probably safe for you to leave." "My God, it's 2. I had no idea it was that late. I smiled. Maybe I'll be needing a wooden shelf or two for my condo soon. He grinned, and I swear, blushed. I'd like that. There was a little click down in my solar plexus. Pleasure. Who needed cupids? I limped in my high heels. One heel on, one heel off. But it was better than going barefoot on freezing cobblestones. Tom let me out the back door, just in case. We both looked up and down the alley. Nothing. Empty. Home free. Thanks for everything, Tom. I shook his hand and felt that warm tingle as our skin met. Probably nothing would come of it, but it was nice anyway. I turned just before I rounded the corner and waved. He waved back, smiling. Then his face changed, and he was running for me. Behind you! I whirled. The cupids were flying in at my back. I flung myself onto the ground. A white arrow buried itself into the cobblestones near my head. Tom was running toward me, shouting. A white arrow took him through the chest. He staggered back, eyes wide and surprised. He stumbled back a few steps, then fell backward onto the cobblestones. I screamed, "Tom!" I heard the whir of wings above me. I turned, slowly, and stared into shining blue eyes. A small feminine mouth smiled at me. The little gold bow pulled back, a white arrow pointing at me. A second cupid with slightly paler hair and baby blue wings floated off to the left. Bow trained on me. I wasn't getting away this time. "Get it over with, you ugly little harpies!" I yelled. I threw my shoe at them, the one with the broken heel. The cupid dodged effortlessly. How could something that chubby be so graceful? I saw the arrow leave the bow, then felt a sharp pain in my chest, over my heart. Then nothing but darkness. Tom and I woke in the alley and did the only thing we were able to do: fall in love. It was a nice wedding as weddings go. Our mothers sat in the front rows beaming at us. Both of them admitted to having bribed the cupids, but it had all worked out for the best, they said, smiling smugly. We smiled back. What else could we do? Arrows of true love had hit both of us. We were in love, married, happy, vengeful. My mother is a widow. Tom's mother is divorced. All we need now is a corrupt cupid with a sweet tooth.
The Edge of the Sea. This is another story that I wrote when I lived in California for a few years. It's the only time in my life that I've lived near the water. I've almost drowned 4 times. At one point, I had my dive certificate. I thought it would help me overcome my phobias. Then I had a diving accident, and now I'm claustrophobic on top of being afraid of water. Oh well. This is a very sensual story, and was the first peek of that side of me as a writer. But it is a melancholy story. The idea of it, that fear and longing that the ocean fills me with, will be visited at more length in an upcoming Anita book. Some of the characters introduced in Dance Macabre will be helping me explore some of the themes of this story in more loving and even more frightening detail.
The Edge of the Sea. Adria woke to the sound of the sea. She lay under the cool wash of sheets, wondering what had woken her. Moonlight spilled through the white curtains. The rushing hush of the sea poured underneath the balcony. It filled the bedroom with an intimate whispering noise. What had woken her? There was a sense of urgency, as if she had forgotten something. She sat up, brushing strands of dark hair away from her face. She called out, not really expecting an answer. "Rachel?" The only sound was ocean, a purring roar along the sand. Adria slipped on a pair of jeans that lay rumpled on the bed. Her nightshirt flapped almost to her knees, a man's extra large. She padded barefoot over scattered fitness magazines and clothes. The living room stretched perfectly neat, like a magazine cover, where no one lived. Rachel's neat and tidy hand was visible everywhere. Adria's hand brushed the music box on the end table. It sang a few forlorn notes. The music boxes were Rachel's hobby. She called them her vice. Adria walked across the thick, white carpet to the short hall. It led to the bathroom and Rachel's bedroom. The door stood ajar, moonlight spilling into the black hallway. Adria froze, pulse thudding against her throat. The urgency she had woken with turned to fear. They had shared the house for almost 2 years. In all that time, Rachel never left her door open. She had a habit of listening to music as she fell asleep. The sound would leak through the house if the door were open. No sound. The rushing sea seemed muted in the hall. Adria paused, almost touching the door. "Rachel?" Silence. "Rachel, can you hear me?" Adria touched the door. It swung inward. The bed was rumpled, pale sheets turned to silver by the moonlight. Rachel's clothes lay neatly folded on the back of the room's only chair. Even her shoes were toes out, heels touching, just waiting to be put on again. The drapes flapped in the wind, cords slapping the screen. Adria jumped, then laughed, but the laughter sounded wrong. So quiet. She walked to the window. There was always a chance Rachel had gone outside, though that was more something Adria would do than Rachel. The beach was a narrow whiteness, heavy and pale under the moon. The ocean rolled gray and silver, white foam riding the waves as it whisper-roared, eating away at the shore. Rocks gleamed dull black as the surf swirled and blew white spray up into the air. During the day, Adria had jogged every inch of the beach, but moonlight made it an alien place. Adria heard something, a moan, a muffled cry. She wasn't sure if it was the sound of pleasure or pain. Adria smiled to herself. If she went out there and Rachel had a boyfriend on the beach... Adria turned back to the room. No, there were no other clothes. If Rachel had undressed, so would he. Rachel had only brought 2 men home in as many years. Both times she had given Adria advance warning. Rachel was not a casual person in her surroundings or her relationships. Adria checked the open bathroom, but she knew, could feel, how empty the house was now. She was alone, alone with the sea, and Rachel was out there somewhere. Adria began listening to her own heartbeat. It was impossibly loud. Something was very wrong. She slipped on a pair of deck shoes and opened the sliding glass door that led down to the beach. She left it open behind her, a vague thought that she wanted someone to know where she had gone. The night air was cool. She shivered in the thin shirt. She debated on going back and getting a sweatshirt, but no, she needed to find Rachel. Rachel's footprints started at the bottom of the steps. They led down near the surf where the sand was firm, wet, and easier to walk in. Water swirled shockingly cold around Adria's ankles. The water was crumpling the edges of the tracks, sweeping them away. Adria began to jog, hoping to trace the prints before the sea took them. She fell into a familiar easy stride, arms pumping, breath deep and even. It felt good. Her fear faded in the face of something so ordinary. The only sounds were the rush of waves and the slap of her feet as she ran. Moonlight gleamed along the shore, showing everything in stark shadows and silver light. The footprints ended at the rocks. Adria touched a cold boulder and began to clamber over them. She slipped on a strand of seaweed and fell hard on one knee. The sharp pain forced her to lean against the damp rock and wait for the knee to move again. She could see over the rocks now to the beach beyond. They were there. Rachel's long blonde hair was spilled out across the sand. He lay on top of her, his nude body made up of muscle, pale flesh, and shadows. Adria felt foolish, surprised, and relieved. She meant to turn away, to leave them to their privacy, but something stopped her. A wave curled up the beach and tugged Rachel's hand up and down, loose, limp, unresisting. Adria watched for a few minutes, embarrassment swallowed up by fear. Rachel never moved. Not a hand, not her head, not her leg. There was a limp quality to her as the man rode her that was more terrifying than any struggle. The man buried his face in the sand, bearing Rachel's face to the sky. The face was totally slack. Nothing. Adria couldn't breathe for a moment, couldn't think. She screamed, "Rachel!" The man looked up, startled. Adria had an impression of dark eyes, impossibly large, a sculpted face. Beautiful was the word that flashed on her mind. She scrambled down the rocks, not sure what she would do if he didn't run. Had to try. She was screaming as she came. Someone would hear. Someone had to hear. He stood, and there was a tension to him. Adria stopped, panting, and stared at him across the sand. Across Rachel's body. She had seen a wolf once, while hiking in the mountains. It had turned startled eyes to her. There had been nothing human in its eyes. There was nothing human now. A light flashed on at the nearest house. He jumped, startled, and ran, not up the shore, but toward the sea. He ran into the surf, and it cut him across the waist, and he dived between the waves, clean and neat, vanished. She watched his head surface, and then his arms as he stroked for deeper water. Then he dived, and what splashed after him was the curving lines of a tail, like a whale or a dolphin. He vanished under the waves. Adria stood there for a heartbeat. She couldn't have seen it, could she? Adria glanced back at Rachel. She lay unmoving, horribly still. Adria knelt in the wet sand. Her shaking hands couldn't find a pulse. She pressed her ear to the chest and held her own breath. Adria had expected to hear a heartbeat. Even though she had thought death, she wasn't prepared for silence. She pressed her cheek against Rachel's slack mouth. Nothing. No breath. "Oh God! Oh God!" A man's voice called from the house where the light had flashed on. "Is everyone all right down there?" Adria couldn't answer for a minute. Couldn't think. Then she yelled, "Get an ambulance! And get the police! It's an emergency! Hurry!" "I'll call! Don't worry!" He rushed back inside. Tears threatened hot and close. "No!" She tilted Rachel's head back, pinched off the nostrils, and began breathing for her. The chest rose and fell. 4 breaths. 4 rises. Adria stopped. "Breathe, Rachel, breathe!" Surf rushed in and tugged at her body. "Damn it, Rachel! Damn it!" Adria breathed, then cupped her hands over the chest and pumped, counting. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. She crawled back to Rachel's head and breathed, then pumped the chest. "Rachel, breathe, damn it, breathe! Oh, God, help me!" Tears choked her, trying to steal her own breath away. She couldn't cry yet. Not yet. A man was there in his pajamas and bathrobe. He knelt in the wet sand. "I called the ambulance and the cops." Adria looked at him. She couldn't think of what to say. "Help me!" "I'll pump the heart if you breathe." She really looked at him for the first time. Younger than she had thought. She nodded and breathed 3 quick breaths. He pumped the heart like he knew what he was doing. "Rachel, please, please." Breathing, breathing until she felt lightheaded. She looked at the man as he worked to start Rachel's heart. His eyes held hopelessness. Adria shook her head, tears tracing like fire down her cheeks. "Don't worry," he said. "I won't give up until you do." "Then we won't give up." They were still trying to breathe life into Rachel when the ambulance came. Adria sat in the rising surf, watching as they worked on Rachel. They punched needles into her arm, set up an IV of some clear liquid. They did what Adria and the man had done, but nothing worked. Adria noticed the world looked flat, one-dimensional. There was no depth to anything. And all the noises seemed distant, dreamlike. She stared at her own hand and couldn't figure out what was wrong. Why had everything changed? They strapped Rachel to a gurney and began to carry her up the steps to the road. The police came in a flash of red and blue lights, a kaleidoscope against the darkness. There were men asking questions, but Adria couldn't concentrate on it. She couldn't hear them. Someone had thrown a jacket over her shoulders. It was too big, and sleeves flapped in the wind as she followed the gurney to the ambulance. A tall man with a gold shield clipped to his coat stopped her, putting a hand on her shoulder.
"We'll need to ask you a few questions."
She nodded.
"I understand, but later."
She looked up at him.
"I have to go to the hospital. For Rachel."
"I understand. Just tell us where he went. You are our only witness." She nodded.
He swam out to sea."
The detective frowned. "Are you sure?"
"He swam out to sea."
"Thank you." A second detective pushed close and looked ready to ask other questions, but there must have been something in her face that stopped him. "We'll talk to you tomorrow then, miss." She nodded and crawled into the ambulance. Adria made herself as small as possible riding in the corner, not crying anymore. Everything seemed so distant, unreal, dreamlike. The world wasn't meant to be flat, like cardboard. The sirens blared to life, and they were out on the highway in a spill of gravel and brakes. She looked up at the paramedic as he checked Rachel one more time. He met Adria's eyes once, and then wouldn't look at her again. Wasn't it a bad sign when they wouldn't look at you?
"She's a doctor."
He glanced at Adria.
"What?" "Dr. Rachel Corbin. That's her name."
It seemed important that he know she was a doctor. Adria wasn't sure why, but if anything made Rachel who she was, it was that. She was a doctor. He whispered, "Oh, God," and shouted something through the window to the driver. Rachel's hospital was the nearest one, so very close. They would take Rachel to Rachel's hospital, Rachel's emergency room. The police drove Adria back home as dawn was easing through the clouds. She stood in her own living room, looking out the sliding glass door. The sea was an immense blue, rolling out and out until it touched the sky. The sun was rising and Rachel wasn't rushing out to her car. Adria would still be in bed. The vague roar of Rachel's car was one of the sounds of morning, but not today. The doctors had given her something to take. They said she was in shock. She hadn't taken the pills yet, and if this was shock, it didn't feel so bad. It didn't feel like anything. Adria felt distant, light, as if a strong wind would blow her away, shatter her into slivers of glass. She knew Rachel was dead, but it was a distant knowing, as if all of last night had happened to someone else. If she walked into the other room, Rachel's things would be there waiting. But Rachel would never come for them. Adria tried to make last night a lie as she stared out at the sea, so bright and blue, so inviting. The dark-haired detective said, "Ms. Reynolds, do you feel up to answering questions now? I wouldn't ask, but you are our only witness, and the sooner we start, the sooner we can catch him." She answered without turning around, staring out the window.
"Yes, I understand."
"Tell me what happened last night. Take your time." Adria took a deep breath and let it out. Her voice belonged to someone else. She listened to some other person tell about waking up and going out to look for Rachel. The voice that was hers and not hers told everything, even glimpses of something impossible. The second detective had gold-framed glasses that didn't quite hide his eyes. "Excuse me, Miss Reynolds, would you repeat that, please?"
"Repeat what?"
"The part starting, 'I watched him swim out to sea and then he dived, flashing a length of tail, like a whale or a dolphin.' Is that what you meant to say, Miss Reynolds?" Adria thought about that for a minute, cheek pressed against the cool glass.
"I didn't mean to mention it to you, no. It's what I thought I saw."
She shook her head, forehead against the glass. "I don't know." "Ms. Reynolds," his voice was condescending. Humor the poor hysterical witness. "You're saying the perpetrator was a mermaid?" She turned to stare at him, a small flash of anger making her feel more like herself. Not a mermaid. Merman. A triton. A male equivalent. His face showed what he thought of that theory. "I don't know, Detective. I don't know if I saw it, or dreamed it, or hallucinated. I just found my best friend murdered, brutalized. I don't know.
Is there anything else? I'm very tired."
She wanted his condescension, his pity, out of her house, out of their house. The dark-haired detective stood. Adria thought he frowned at his partner. "Ms. Reynolds, You had a very traumatic experience last night. There's nothing wrong with seeing things under that kind of stress.
I suppose not.
She hesitated and asked,
Do other murder witnesses see monsters?
He folded his notebook up and put it in his coat pocket. In a manner of speaking, yes, they do.
She turned away from his eyes, kind, sad eyes that had seen too much until Rachel's death was just one more among too many.
We'll want you to come down and talk to a sketch artist when you're ready. I don't mean to rush you. I know how hard this is on you. She started to accuse him of not understanding, but his eyes wouldn't let her. They had seen more death than Adria would ever see, if she was lucky. Get some rest, Miss Reynolds. Use those pills the doctor gave you. That's what they're there for.
Adria turned back to the window.
Let's go, Frank. We've got all we need for a while. The detective with the gold-framed glasses seemed ready to argue, but he followed his partner. We'll leave a patrol car outside for a day or two. Don't be alarmed.
I'm not. The thought that the killer might come back to hurt her didn't seem real or possible, not in the broad light of day. The door shut, and she was alone. She took a long, hot shower and 2 of the pills the doctor had given her. Adria tracked water across the carpet. Rachel wouldn't care. She would never fix her famous apple omelets for them late at night. No more popcorn and sad movies. No more anything.
Adria choked back a sob. If she started crying, she felt as if she would split into pieces and fall down a long black hole. She collapsed on the unmade bed, hair wet, wrapped in towels. A deep, dreamless sleep pulled her under. She woke to late-day sunlight. She had slept nearly 12 hours. The first thought was, Rachel is dead. The knowledge was a leaden emptiness. It was as if a great hole had opened up inside her, and that hole was full of pain and rage and helplessness. Rachel was the 3rd victim of what the newspapers were now calling the beach rapist. The only thing the victims had in common was where they had been killed, at the edge of the sea. 2 victims hadn't been newsworthy. 3 seemed to be the magic number. There was a serial killer loose.
What had Rachel been doing out on the beach?
Why Rachel? Adria needed answers, but there was no one to ask. She checked her watch, not for time, but for what day it was. It seemed like it had taken weeks for Rachel to die, the hospital. Days at least, but her watch said it was only Sunday. Only hours had passed. Only hours and Rachel was gone, just like that. Adria dressed and tried to comb the tangles from her hair, but it didn't seem to matter all that much. The numbness shredded, falling away. Tears choked at the back of her throat. She took another little pill, just one. She didn't want to sleep, but she wanted the pain to go away. Had she really told the detective the murderer was a Triton? Had she really seen a tail? Adria closed her eyes and saw it, flashing in the moonlight, wet and slick, and attached to the man. Could she have made it up, to make the brutality more understandable? Like a child saying a monster did it, instead of Daddy. Adria shook her head. It didn't help to call the man a Triton. It raised more questions. Why would she hallucinate the man was a merman? Co-workers from the health club came in the next few hours to cry, offer comfort, and be comforted. Adria did not want any of them, didn't want to grieve in a group. It cheapened it to share memories and sob on each other's shoulders. None of them had really known Rachel. She refused to exercise. She was 5'9" and had never gained weight. Adria was 9 inches shorter. Adria had to work at staying in shape. She could never convince Rachel to go to the club. Adria asked all the people to go away. Their kind intentions, their helpfulness, their sorrow, it was all more than Adria could deal with. She needed to be alone, wanted to be alone. She wasn't ready for company, no matter how well-intentioned. Adria told no one about her delusion. There was no such thing as mermaids or mermen. She didn't want to see pity and knowing looks among their friends. When the flock of mourners had been chased away, Adria lay down on the couch and waited for the tranquilizer to give her sleep. She woke. Gasping in the darkness, strange dreams vanished, nightmares fading. She had vague images of ocean and strong hands trying to drown her. Darkness lay pressed against the sliding glass doors. Moonlight shivered through the closed drapes. Adria sat up, abrupt, and felt dizzy and awkward. She couldn't remember closing the drapes. Her head felt like cotton, her throat horribly dry. Too many pills. She felt detached, the rush of fear dying under the dregs of the tranquilizer. A shadow fluttered against the drapes. Adria stood, a little unsteady. Was it a man's shadow? She touched the drapes, soft, cool. Fear was back, adrenaline chasing the tranquilizer away. The sound of her own heart was obscenely loud. Adria shoved the drapes back, sudden, and he was there. He stood, naked and beautiful, on the other side of the glass. She tried to scream, but couldn't, not while looking into his eyes, dark and peaceful. He put a hand against the glass, spread it flat. There was webbing between his fingers like a frog's. Adria touched fingertips to the glass. The webbing began to shrink, smaller and smaller, until it melted away, like a moonlit dream. He smiled then, and she felt his need like a physical touch. His hand touched the door lock. Adria jerked back, startled, frightened, awake. The drapes fell shut. The moonlight gleamed empty. Adria peeked round the drapes, hand shaking. There was nothing there. Had she dreamed it? She had been dreaming of him, of strong hands pushing her under the water. Adria stared at the empty deck. Moonlight glittered off something. She knelt against the glass and stared. There was a puddle of water on the deck. There was no rain this time of year. Adria was halfway to the phone to call the police when she stopped. What could she say? I saw webbing between his fingers and it melted away? They wouldn't believe her, and he had known they wouldn't. He had come to taunt her, or to kill her. Adria remembered the feel of him inside her mind, slick and cold and warm, like nothing had ever felt. She wondered what he could have done if she hadn't been on the pills, half dead to the world. If he had opened the door. Adria knew now how he had gotten Rachel down on the beach. He had called her, lured her, with himself as bait. The police wouldn't find him, because he could go places they couldn't, places they would never dream of going. Adria knew the truth, but no one would believe her. It was crazy. If she'd had her gun tonight, she could have given him a surprise. Would bullets hurt a Triton? They didn't hurt vampires, did they? Adria couldn't remember any stories about how to kill a mermaid, just fairy tales. The morning paper showed another victim, miles from Adria. Adria drank morning coffee with a gun lying on the table. She had bought it years ago when her ex-husband had traveled a lot and left her alone. It was cleaned, oiled, and loaded. The hammer rested on an empty chamber. If 5 bullets weren't enough, well, Adria didn't think it would matter. The Triton didn't come back, but he killed 2 more women. The police were baffled, looking for lifeguards, triathletes. They weren't even close. Adria stayed safe and warm and dry, and another woman died. He was killing almost every other night. The police were frantic. Everyone on the beach was terrified. When Rachel had been dead almost 4 weeks, Adria dreamed of the Triton again. Strong webbed hands caressed her skin. She swam underwater and breathed. She woke halfway across her bedroom floor. Her feet were tangled in a pair of discarded old jeans. Almost tripping had woken her. Adria swallowed, tried to breathe, tried to think. She heard his song then, inside her head. Music that cried and wept, that rolled and roared, lonely as the sea, vast and deep, promising miracles. She stood frozen for a moment, listening. Adria stumbled back to her bed and sat down on the edge of the rumpled sheets. She could not go to him, should not, would not. The song sighed and eased her mind, until she was standing. His need was in the music, strong and deep, careless as the ocean itself, and as unstoppable. She picked up her robe from the floor and slipped it on. It felt real and soft. She picked up the gun from the bedside table and put it in the robe pocket. It hung heavy and awkward, bumping her leg as she walked. She could not deny him, but she might be able to surprise him. The moon rode high and almost full, shimmering silver on the rolling waves. The sea whispered, adding to the Triton's song. Music and ocean hissed and roared until Adria could not be sure who was singing to her. Was it the sea? Did the sea itself want to touch her, to hold her? Yes, the sea wanted her. It was not love the sea offered, but violent need, a need so great it filled the world with crying. She walked at the edge of the wet sand, as the lips of curling waves sloshed over her ankles. High tide was spilling inland. She waded ankle-deep to the rocks, the water soaking the edge of her robe, pulling, tripping. The song said, "Leave it." But Adria climbed the rocks with the heavy robe still on. She didn't remember why it was important to keep it on, but there was a reason. The beach was bigger on the other side. Part of it stayed dry. She thought of Rachel, and fear, grief filled her mind. But the sea took her terror and her sorrow and wove it into its song. Her throat was tight with fear, heart threatening to choke her. She slipped down to dry sand and waited for the sea to come. A chill wind blew off the ocean. She shivered, and the song took the thread of her chill, for the singer had never been cold. There was something heavy in her pocket that pressed against the damp robe, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the sea. Something bobbed out in the surf, dark and small. A sea lion, maybe. The head disappeared and surfaced closer to shore. It wasn't a seal. The Triton let the waves sweep him up on the shore, tumbling. His upper half was the muscular paleness she remembered, except for the long dark hair. Below the waist, he was a soft, grayish black, abrupt against the white skin, as if somebody had pieced together two different creatures. There was a small ridge along his spine like a whale's humped back. His tail flukes whipped up and down, a dull half-moon. He lay on his stomach in the surf and watched Adria with eyes so huge and luminous they seemed to have a light of their own. Tail began to melt, like wax exposed to heat. The tail flukes became blunt. The main trunk began to shrink, growing tight in the shadow of legs pressed against the shrinking skin. His face flickered in pain, and that fed into his song. It hurt to change over. Adria felt his pain, crumbling to her knees, staring, waiting, needing. He stood, nude and human, his dark hair hanging in wet curls round his face. He called out to her, inside her head, the music sliding and seducing. She went to him. He was tall. She came only to the middle of his chest. When he reached for her, moonlight glistened through the webbing on his hands. Adria took a step back, away. He frowned, and the song roared inside her until she could hear only that. She watched him come closer. He undid her robe, pushing it open. She shivered as the wind blew against her nightshirt. His hands cupped her breasts. Water soaking through the shirt, cold. His face bent over her, eyes huge and drowning deep. Terror flashed through her. She shook her head, violently, tried to step back. He grabbed her, pressing her against the hard cold of his body. The song roared in her head, but her fear rode the waves. The sea had come to drag her down, and she was afraid. His mouth closed over hers, probing. His lips nibbled down her neck. Adria tried to scream, but she couldn't. She was afraid. Afraid of the song, afraid of the sea, afraid of this thing touching her, but she could not scream, could not move. He spilled her back onto the sand. Strong hands tore her nightshirt, leaving her gasping and half-naked. Waves rushed in, spilling over her breasts, curling between her legs. He knelt over her, staring down, arrogant, no pity, no doubts. The sea made flesh. She meant nothing to him. The song clanged through her mind, a roaring violence, a vast, unknowing, guiltless thing. She whispered, "No." He lowered himself on top of her, skin cold, so cold. Waves splashed over his back and spilled into her face. He still kissed and bit along her skin. The hardness of him rested against her panties. "No." Still only a whisper. She needed to shout, to scream, "No!" Then she remembered the gun. His hands ripped away her damp panties. He lowered his hips, eyes distant. The gun clicked on the empty chamber. Adria pulled the trigger again. The gun fired through the robe pocket. The shot seemed to explode, so loud. His body jerked, eyes staring at her, seeing her for the first time. She pulled the trigger again. He jerked, then slumped over her. The song ended abruptly, jarring. Adria's breath came in ragged gasps. She tried to push him off her, but couldn't. He was too heavy. She panicked, beating at his arms and chest. His blood flowed warm onto her skin. She took a deep breath that quavered and let it out. "I'm all right. I'm all right." She began to crawl out from under him, his body dragging along her skin as she wiggled free. She was crying now, sobbing. She began screaming, low, tiny screams. The screams frightened her because she couldn't stop them. She crawled free of him and clawed through the sand until she was free of the water. She sat in the dry sand, letting it cake the wet robe. She held the gun in her hand, loosely. A wave washed over him, and his hand waved limp, moved by the water. An image of Rachel flashed through her mind. She put a shaking hand against her mouth to stop the awful whimpering screams. His hand clenched. Adria stopped breathing for a moment. He raised his head. She felt his mind reach out for her. It was like the slow drag of the sea when you're tired, and it would be better, easier to rest, to let the water take you down. He got to his feet. Adria raised the gun, two-handed. Blood flowed from 2 wounds in his stomach, but he never hesitated. The sea did not acknowledge death. Blood blossomed in his chest. He staggered, but kept coming. Adria fired, watching the bullets explode into his chest, ears ringing with the noise. He fell to his knees, and then slid to one side, slowly, so slowly. He lay on his side in the dry sand, staring at her. His dark eyes were patient as the sea, nothing in them that she could read or understand. He didn't seem to be able to move. His chest was a bloody mess. He lay only an arm's length from her. She watched his life pour out into the sand. He blinked. Adria pointed the gun at those eyes and squeezed the trigger. The gun bounced in her hands. A neat red hole appeared in his forehead, blood leaking into his eyes. His eyes stared sightless, the light gone out of them. Adria did not check his pulse to make sure he was dead. She backed off, the empty gun still in her hand, and began running for home. She looked back once from the top of the rocks. The body lay pale and dark, shadow-patched. Nothing moved. Adria ran. She heard police sirens a long way off. The strobe lights flickered outside her windows, colored shadows against the curtains. The police found blood on the sand, but no body. The beach rapist did not strike again. Was he really dead? Or had he just started hiding the bodies, letting the ocean take evidence away? Adria couldn't sleep with the sea whispering outside her window anymore. She sold the house for a nice price, even with the murders. Beachfront property was dear. Adria moved inland, far from the sea. But there are nights when the rustle of leaves outside her window becomes the rushing of the sea. And there is an echo in her head, a hiss of distant music. Adria is looking for someplace out of state, someplace where the sea does not touch the land for hundreds of miles on any side. Surely, there she will be safe.